Steve Warren, here, 78er, coming from the Tom Keneally Centre at Sydney Mechanics School of Arts, hoping that my little contribution to the story may inspire you to get involved with your community, because all those little contributions are what lead to positive change.
Steve, thank you for talking to me. Before I ask you about your memories of that first Mardi Gras parade on the 24th of June 1978, can you tell us a bit about your early activism?
Well, that's a good question. If I take it back to high school, it wasn't until the senior years of high school that I even understood to some degree that I was even gay. And I was actually playing in a rock band, and the singer of the band was gay, and we were very good friends. And he came out to me, and shortly after that period we actually went to a Polly's dance in Mascot, and that was my first experience of seeing a gay nightclub.
What was Polly's dance?
Well,
Polly's dance, what was that?
It's a group that still exists to this day. I don't know what their focus was apart from being a gay social group, but they were well known for running gay dances back in the 70s and 80s, right up to the current period. Ironically, I actually just went to a Polly's dance 2 weeks ago with a few 78er and MAG colleagues, and it's the first time I'd been back to Polly's since the 80s.
No way.
So it brought back a lot of memories, and I was sending texts to my friend, the singer in the band, about that first night we went to Polly's and what an eye-opener that was, and the different clubs we went to after that. So then he introduced me to the Aquarius Club, which was also a rotating gay social dance. It was more focused on rock music, whereas Polly's, I think, back then was more on disco music. And at that time it was run at Paddington Town Hall. And then he introduced me to another gay bar that used to be called Jules, that was on the bottom of Crown Street, which later on became a hard rock cafe for a while. So that was my first opening into the gay world.
Were you involved with groups in anyone like Camp New South Wales?
Not directly. I do remember going to camp. I don't know whether it was that I caught up with Stuart Round at camp, or whether Stuart introduced us to camp, I'm not quite sure. I do remember going there a couple of times and talking with Stuart there, and Jeff Stanton, another 78er friend of mine. But I didn't get really involved with the group.
So, carry on.
Again, it was just really interesting as a young person to discover this place where people could be open and relaxed about who they were and talk about what was happening in our community.
You were very young at the time, weren't you?
Yeah, it was very early 20s.
So, on the 24th of June 1978, there were 3 events. Were you at the morning parade, which was more of a protest down George Street?
Yes, I did attend the morning parade, and I was good friends with another 78er called Jeff McCarthy, and I'm pretty sure it was Jeff that told me about the morning parade. So I remember that march at Town Hall that morning.
What was the atmosphere like?
It was quite interesting. It's a little bit of a blur for me because I didn't get involved directly in gay politics as such, but I started to get involved with various political groups. Became very keen about social justice issues, and I started going to the May Day marches, so I was getting a bit used to going to protest marches. So it was just another protest march, but of course it had a significance because it was looking at the whole issue of homosexual law reform, which up to that point I was very naive and didn't even have a good understanding about why it's even against the law. It was something that didn't make a lot of sense to me at the time.
And on that morning protest march, were there many problems with the police, or was it quite peaceful and safe?
I don't recall any problems with the police. There was very different times of the police force then. A lot of them were very big, burly policemen. They were a little bit intimidating just in themselves, but I don't remember any dramas about it.
And then there was a series of afternoon meetings at Paddington Town Hall. Did you go to that event?
No, I didn't go to that community forum. I heard about it, but I didn't attend that. And that was actually at the venue where we had the Aquarius Club.
Oh, really? Ah. Then in the evening, there was the parade, which we now call the first Mardi Gras. How did you find out about that?
I'd probably heard something about it in the morning, and I don't remember how much I took notice of that in the morning. But we're regular going to a series of nightclubs on Oxford Street, and I was at Patches that night. And there was a drag act there called Trixie Lamond, and we used to get on really fabulously with Trixie. And I remember Trixie literally dragging us out of the bar, taking us downstairs to the parade, where there was chants of out of the bars and into the streets. And that's how we came to join the parade as it was going down Oxford Street.
So you were not there at Taylor Square at the beginning?
No, I was not at Taylor Square at the beginning.
And so you joined from Patches?
That's right.
Can you remember at all the numbers that were there in the parade?
It's very hard to judge that, especially as having been to several different parades and protests, you get a bit lost on which is which. But on that night, I tended to go by what it was like in my high school, because we had 1,000 students at our high school, and it looked like in a crowd of about 1,000 that night.
You weren't involved in any way in the organisation, were you?
No, I didn't know the organisers then. I did become really close friends of Lance Galland, who was one of the organisers.
And he was the driver of the float at the front?
Yes. But I didn't really know Lance then, but I think I met Lance maybe a couple of years before at one of the May Day marches, where we actually ended up at a party at the Communist Party headquarters in Sydney.
So you were involved with the Communist Party previously?
No, not directly. It's just that a lot of the groups that were involved with May Day, and Jeff McCarthy was very much involved with that circle of politics at the time. So I just went along with friends, and we ended up at this party. I remember going to a party at the Communist Party.
How far up Oxford Street was Patches? Or how close to Hyde Park, between Taylor Square and Hyde Park, was it?
It's not a great distance from Patches to Hyde Park, so it's probably 2/3 of the way down Oxford Street from Taylor Square.
So you got the tail end of the parade?
Yes.
So you joined the parade. Were you welcomed into the parade by other people?
Yes, we were made feel very welcome. The atmosphere was great. It was very much like a celebration. It seemed a lot of fun. We didn't know exactly how far the parade was going. We did notice when we got to College Street that there was a drama going on up at front, and that the police had confiscated the truck.
That Lance was driving?
Which Lance was driving. And it looked like they were trying to arrest Lance and another passenger that was in the truck. But we weren't totally sure what was going on. We were led to believe there was to be a bit of a celebration in Hyde Park, that didn't really go ahead because of what was unfolding between the police and the float at the time.
Was that the first moment, the first point that you noticed a problem with the police? When you were actually going down Oxford Street, do you sense any tenseness or any problems?
No, it didn't, and probably because of the camaraderie that we felt with joining in with others going down Oxford Street, and there would have been a lot of familiar faces that we knew from the other nightclubs on Oxford Street who also joined the parade from coming out of the bars, that we just felt totally safe. And as I said, people were skipping and laughing and singing.
And going down Oxford Street, was the mood one of celebration? Was it one of frustration? Was it one of anger, passion?
It was very much a mood of celebration. Passion was...
So College Street, the police are trying to get Lance out of the truck. Do they arrest him?
No, they didn't go ahead with an arrest. But, it certainly looked that there was some tension about that. Not being an organiser, I didn't know exactly what was going on at the truck. I could just see that there was, the police had dragged him out of the truck, had parked the truck on the side on College Street.
At that point, did you witness any police violence? Apart from obviously trying to drag him out?
Only the rough handling of getting Lance out of the truck.
And then what happened? Where did you all head to?
Well, we were all still milling around in Hyde Park at that point, wondering what was going to happen. The public address system was on the truck and that was confiscated. So the whole idea of having a celebration at the park seemed to be quickly evaporating. Some people started making announcements in the park. I remember Jeff McCarthy getting up and saying some things. I remember Jeff Stanton also saying that we should go onto the cross, talking about the camaraderie of people in the cross, and there was a lot of common areas around the King's Cross area that related to our community. And both Jeffs spoke about a lot of similar issues, about the discrimination of gay people to also people of low income, of people of Indigenous background and multicultural backgrounds up in the cross area. And it was decided that we continue and go up to the cross.
Now, when you were going to Oxford Street, just to go back a bit, when you were going towards Hyde Park, do you remember any music coming from the van, the truck or anything?
Yes, there was music playing, there were songs playing.
Do you remember any of them in particular?
There were a few songs playing that I don't specifically remember, but there were two that probably stood out. I think one was Ode to a Gym
Teacher.
Gym Teacher.
Is that Meg Christensen or Meg Christensen?
Yes, I think so.
And what was the other?
Happy to be Gay, something?
Tom Robinson.
Tom
Glad
Robinson.
to be gay.
Glad to be gay, that's it. Glad to be gay.
And so
I was more into rock music, so these
Yeah,
were sort of
wasn't
folk
kind of your
culture
thing.
music, but I remember the songs and they did stick in our mind for
And so because
quite
you
some years afterwards.
weren't an organiser, you presumably weren't aware of what the licence covered for the parade. Because I understand there was a
No, I
licence.
didn't learn anything about the whole issue of the permit for the parade until some years later. At the time, I wasn't involved with organising it. I didn't question whether there was or wasn't a permit.
So after College Street, where did you go?
We went up William Street.
Were people
And I was-
running or walking?
Walking was still sort of being pushed to the side by the police, but
So there was police harassment continuing by that point.
well, not in the way that I saw it. I wasn't at the front, and I was told by friends at the front that it was more aggressive reaction between the police at the front of the parade. But along the parade itself, we noticed police were walking with us. They weren't saying anything. They weren't criticising us. They weren't telling us not to march, not to walk. So we didn't think there was any conflict with the police because they just weren't saying much. So we just continued up William Street. I remember seeing a whole group paddy wagons, which was the old blue police wagons in them days, flying along Darlinghurst Road. We had no idea where they were going or why there was this big flurry of paddy wagons going on Darlinghurst. So
Were
we
you
still
scared?
weren't aware of any particular drama.
So you weren't aware, so you didn't feel
Had
fear
no
or
idea
anything?
that there was a drama.
Were you intrigued? Curious?
Well, I was certainly intrigued when we saw these paddy wagons flying along Darlinghurst Road, but they didn't stop where we were. They kept going down the bottom of Darlinghurst Road, out of sight to where we were.
So you went up Darlinghurst Road. Where did you go to?
Down towards the Alamein Fountain. And again, because we used to go to some of the nightclubs along that Darlinghurst Road, again, felt very comfortable, still kept meeting people that we knew in the street. There were lots of people joined the parade. There would have been friends from all different cultural backgrounds who joined in, and people on the street who joined in. Low income people joined in, street kids joined in.
So they were joining in King's Cross.
Yes.
So it wasn't just...
So it kept growing as it went through the cross.
So not just gay men, lesbians, bisexuals. It was people
Yep,
from
there was
other
straight
communities.
people were marching with us in support as well.
Brilliant. What about, one thing I don't hear about is drag queens. Do you remember if there were any drag queens who took part?
Well, Trixie definitely did.
Okay.
Trixie was a drag queen from Thatcher's.
So she was actually
There would have been
marching.
other drag queens, I'm sure.
So the first sign of trouble, when did that happen in King's Cross?
Well, really, it seemed to be all over at the Alamein, near what was known as the Bottoms Up Bar of the Rex Hotel, which was why the Jeffs had suggested going to that end point. That was also a well-known gay bar. Everything seemed okay. People were just sort of excited that we participated in this parade of celebration, ready to just go back and mingle into the night. And then we saw the trouble start. And Jeff and I and a couple of others had spotted police that were hiding in a laneway behind the wrecks.
In uniform?
Yes. That's when it sort of clicked to us that that's where those paddy wagons went. The ones that we'd seen earlier going down Darlinghurst Road, it seemed to us that they'd actually gone to an end point to corral the parade so they could drop us from both ends. And
so you were surrounded?
Yes, more police came in on Darlinghurst Road, so we were stuck in the middle between sort of like the Rex Hotel and the far end of the Alamein.
Did the police at any point give people a warning or ask them to disperse that you remember?
I do remember a warning, and we were given something like 30 seconds to disperse, which was just completely unrealistic. A crowd that had then grown to quite a considerable number.
Do you remember what time of night this may have been?
It was after 10 o'clock at night, so it's probably, I don't know how long it took us to walk there.
I think the parade started at 10,
yeah.
So it would have maybe been around 10:30 to 11.
Yeah, it would have been around 10:30 towards 11.
So the police really didn't give you much of a chance to disperse. What happened then?
No, not once it came to the point of some sort of conflict started brewing. It seemed like literally 30 seconds we were expected to disperse. When with such a large crowd there milling around, just relaxing and enjoying themselves, there was no drama, there was no violence amongst the people that we were with. And then there just seemed to be this furore with the police and a lot of people being grabbed by police, dragged off to paddy wagons, and it really turned quite nasty.
Were the police violent?
Yes.
Were they using batons or just their fists?
Fists, kicking. I do remember batons. We noticed a lot of police had no badges on. In them days they used to wear a number that indicated who they were and if you wanted to identify that police officer. It seemed that a lot of them had taken those badges off and there were no identifying features on those police.
So what did you do?
Well, we all tried to get out of the area. A number of us and our friends, we just wanted to get away from there. It seemed a really nasty, awful situation. We grabbed a few people that had already been grabbed by police. I remember a few of us grabbing Jeff Stanton to drag him out of going into the back of a paddy wagon, and Jeff got away. Others were taken off in the paddy wagon and doors slammed on them, and some of them still had their arms or hands hanging out the back of the paddy wagon and the doors were just slammed on them.
On their arms?
Yes.
And their hands? And when the police were going for people, were they being indiscriminate or were they targeting specific individuals?
It seemed indiscriminate, but they were particularly nasty to some of the lesbian women. I do remember that.
So they were attacking women as well as men?
Yes.
Did you see any blood, do you remember?
No, I don't particularly recall that, but
were you arrested?
Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. No, I wasn't arrested on the night.
Were you hit? Were you assaulted?
No, I don't think we were hit. I think we probably were pushed in a nasty way by some police, but we just grabbed people and pulled people back and went onto the footpaths and tried to get up the street and away into shops.
Was it a riot?
Well, I guess by definition maybe you'd call it a riot, but it wasn't a riot. It certainly wasn't a riot by those who were involved in the parade.
What do you think?
But it's a riot in terms of the violence that happened with the police and their interactions with people in the parade.
What do you think motivated the violence? Was it police homophobia or the fact you were standing up to authority? Or was it that they were power hungry and they wanted an excuse to exert that power?
I think it's a combination of things. Some of it still exists to this day. The police are employed by the state to keep an eye on protests, that they feel that they've got some role to control or influence the way the protests go. There's a real conflict, which I must say must even be difficult for police, that they're perceived as playing a role to squash people from speaking out about issues with government when we should be more open to people being democratic and speaking out against poor government policies.
At what point did the police disperse? And why, do you think?
I think there was probably too many people in the crowd and the cross at that point, and they didn't know how to control it either.
Do you think they'd filled
And
up
I
their
think
paddy
they probably
wagons?
given up and had grabbed people that they felt were that may have been targeted because they may have seen some people as being a problem because they reacted back to the police. They rounded up quite a few people in paddy wagons. I think they just came to a conclusion.
How did you feel at that point? Were you upset? Were you angry? Were you scared? Were you numb?
I think it was all those things.
In shock?
You're in shock, you're scared of what's going on, you're wondering why the hell this is happening. You're angry about the lack of social justice. From a young age I had a very strong social justice sense, so I used to internalise that and get very angry about seeing any social injustice. So that would sort of make my blood boil.
What did you do next? Once the police had gone, what did you do?
We ended up heading back down into the cross.
A big crowd of you?
Well, yes, but all in little different groups of people just
Men and
walking
women?
back, often talking about what had just happened and why it happened. Ended up heading back down towards Oxford Street. We later heard that there was gatherings happening outside the police station near Taylor Square.
So that was Darlinghurst?
Yes.
And that's where the people who'd been arrested had been
That's
taken?
where we were told a lot of the people who were arrested ended up at those cells.
And what?
I was later told that there were people at central cells, but I don't know how much I was aware of that on the night, but there was a big gathering of people outside Darlinghurst police station.
And were people chanting?
Yes, there was chanting. People started passing around things to collect money for bail, because in them days you had to pay a monetary bail to be released on any police charges.
And those chants, do you remember any of them?
The chants.
Yeah.
For some reason I'm thinking of "We Shall Overcome" was sung on the night. I can remember a very moving chant about "We shall overcome."
And apparently, some of the people I've spoken to who had been arrested, they could hear the crowd outside the station. So people were raising money.
Yes.
Were you aware of the condition of any of those arrested, the physical condition?
Not on the night, no.
And at what point do you remember people being released on bail? Were they that night released, or was it later on?
People started being released early in the morning during the night. Yes, it just sort of kept coming in dribs and drabs.
And did you see? So you saw them come out of the police station.
Saw some come out of the police station. Yes.
How were they? Were they shocked?
We didn't stay there all night,
But
some did stay on for quite some time.
What was their mood like? Those who were released on bail, were they in shock? Were they angry? Were they relieved to be out?
I think all of those things again. They were in shock, distressed about the treatment they'd received inside the police station.
Do you know how many were charged?
I think in the end there was about 53 were charged that night.
And so, was there much coverage in the press?
Yes, there was. I think there was coverage in both the main morning papers, the Sydney Morning Herald and the Telegraph was the morning paper back then.
Were their names
main-
published in both?
Yes, names were published, the streets and their area of employment.
What about the gay press? Was that supportive of Mardi Gras in general at the time? Did it give any coverage to the arrests, the police brutality?
I don't recall a lot about what was in the gay press then. I have memories that the gay press wasn't all that active about what was happening at the time, that there were some arguments about whether that was going to upset the culture of Oxford Street and the gay bars, that by exposing that we existed could have the counter effect of closing down what social services existed for us.
Because you'd been in Patches earlier that night, so you were
Yes.
aware of the commercial bar scene, and did you find there was quite a divide between political activism and that more commercial side of gay life?
There was a very mixed view of that in the gay community and the political community. For a lot of us, we were involved with politics, but we enjoyed to have a social night out. So I didn't see that the two were operating against each other.
Do you remember who ran Patches? It wasn't was Dawn O'Donnell involved with Patches in any way?
Well, I think back then Dawn O'Donnell was involved with Patches, and certainly with a few of the other clubs that we used to go to.
So, when people were released on bail, was there any major campaign to drop charges?
Yes, there was, but there's something I was going to say about the police. One of the issues which was also raised in Hyde Park, and why we also felt there was such a conflict with the police at the Cross, was we're aware a lot of the bars used to have to pay bribes to the police. And it was not in the interest of the police to get law reform, because that would dry up a source of probably very dodgy money, if I'd be polite. And I think that had a lot behind why the police were so aggressive about the parade, because it was a celebration, but it was the finale of a day that was set aside about homosexual law reform in New South Wales. And if that law reform was to go through, and even issues about discrimination, which not only affect homosexual men, but affected our lesbian colleagues and transgender, transsexual friends, that would change the whole culture of police corruption, because there wouldn't be the need to pay these bribes at the bars.
Which brings me on to my next question, which I was going to ask later, but I'll ask it now because it's relevant. Do you think that night of the 24th of June, 1978, in any way led to law reform?
Most definitely. I think it was the catalyst that changed the whole direction of law reform in New South Wales. I think it's also important to note, though, that the move towards law reform had been going on for some years. There was a lot of different activities in the gay community and by groups like Camp New South Wales that worked toward, and gay rights lobby.
Yep. Gay and lesbian rights lobby, I think.
Yes, I've forgotten the exact names of the groups back then, but we were certainly not the start of it. We were just the breaking point that set us off into a change. I mean, I remember that later there were arguments about whether Mardi Gras should have happened that night in the first place, because there were fears that it may end up in a clash with police. The irony of that is the clash in police is what changed the public opinion towards the gay community. And when I say gay, it was known back then as the gay Mardi Gras, but we often use the word gay as meaning all our colleagues. We were never discriminatory or excluding others.
It was an umbrella term.
So it was an umbrella term, and it's a term that it still sits in my mind, not for any reasons of excluding anyone or separating from anyone, because it's just a term that we used back in that time.
It was still, though, a few years before there was homosexual law reform. Why do you think there was that gap?
I think there was still, it was very, very different times. There was still a lot of discrimination from the community, a lot of different attitudes. The 70s was also an interesting period for a lot of us, because it was a time there was a lot of challenge into what was seen as social norms that had been part of years of social conditioning about the way that we should behave and accept institutional control. And we were the generation that was saying, well, hang on a minute, a lot of this doesn't add up. We need to relook at these things and try and change that whole balance of how these decisions are made and the whole issue of social justice in our community. So I think people were still locked in a bit of that past conditioning of not knowing how to handle that issue. There was certainly a lot of influence by the church at the time that was very uncomfortable with the whole issue of homosexual, lesbian, transsexual rights. The church didn't know how to cope with all that, so they were reacting against that and putting a lot of pressure on it. It was a Labor government at the time, the Rand government. Some people were very critical of Neville Wran. Over the years in my political and social justice work, I came to know Neville Wran a lot more and see a lot more about how he operated. And I think at the time, Neville Wran was a very clever Labor politician. He knew that to be able to succeed in the goals that the Labor Party wanted for the state at that time, they had to remain in government. If you were to ostracise voters, then you weren't going to remain in government. So he basically threw it back at the community and said, you need to rally the community to get community support. If you've got community support, then you'll get government support. And in the end, that was what won out. There was such a strong sway of community support that despite any of the conservative lobby groups, the government had to concede that it needed law reform. So finally in 1984 it happened, and there was law reform, and there was continuing work on the Anti-Discrimination Acts to change a lot of the other areas of law and discrimination that still existed.
Regarding the charges, did any well-known people such as politicians or celebrities get on board to back a campaign to drop those charges?
I don't recall any particular celebrities being involved, but I wasn't so involved with the gay politics at the time. So it's not something that would come fresh to my mind. I'm sure that there would have been a few in the background that were, and I certainly know there were some very good lawyers and barristers who were involved in our movement who supported the law reform. There would have been a lot of people of political background from major parties that would have also lobbied their own parties for those reforms.
Looking back almost 40 years later, has your perspective changed at all?
Well, it has, in that I grew up in an era where it was not cool to be gay. And that we were discriminated against. We were made to feel very uncomfortable. We were made to feel ashamed of who we were. And that added to our confusion as young people growing up trying to work out what our sexuality was, because we're constantly being put down by society about it. So a lot of those barriers have been removed today. So you feel a lot better in yourself. You feel very comfortable to be who you are. It's a very different atmosphere to be able to go out and just celebrate and have so many close and open links with friends in our community.
Now, the charges were brought to court. Were you present at any of those court cases or outside the court?
No, I wasn't present at the subsequent rallies. I do have memories of going to a rally outside the courthouse on Liverpool Street, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, old Court of Petty Sessions, I think it was, where the police blocked everyone from going into court.
Really? Were they violent in any way, the police?
Well, not really, but just very intimidating in the way that they blocked anyone from entering the courtroom that day.
Now, most of the charges were dropped, weren't they?
Yes.
But am I right in thinking that Peter Murphy's wasn't?
That's correct.
And why do you think most of those charges were dropped?
I think in the end, public opinion had turned against them. I remember there was a media story. I think may have been Channel 7, but I could have got that wrong, or ABC, but certainly one of those media outlets had run a story where they showed what happened at the cross and about the police taking off their ID badges, and it showed the police instigating a lot of the violence. And I recall that one of the arguments in the media, which came out from the court case when they were blaming what we now call the 78ers for the violence, that the video evidence actually showed the opposite, that it wasn't the 78ers that started the conflict. I think on that basis that gave the magistrate the opportunity to overthrow all charges.
Why do you think Peter Murphy was so different? Peter
was, in my understanding, was assaulted by the police particularly in the Darlinghurst police cells, viciously assaulted. It was a very difficult situation, but Peter the Law wasn't that clear cut in the way things were dealt with in the courthouses, and he had to either agree to pleading guilty to some matters, to have larger charges dropped. Peter on principle didn't agree with that from my understanding, and there was no compromise, so Peter got lumbered with the charges, and they didn't want to acknowledge that they had assaulted Peter, and I think they felt it was a catch-22, that if they were to drop things then they'd be leaving themselves open to compensation or reprimand for their behaviour, and Peter just became the scapegoat for that.
So what happened to Peter? I mean, what happened with those charges with Peter? Did it go to court? Was he found guilty?
It went to court. My memory of it was just simply that, I mean, I don't know exactly, it really should be discussed with Peter, but my memory was that Peter was found guilty of it. And over the years that played on me as a 78er. I felt very uncomfortable that Peter in particular had been wronged by the court system and by the police. And that had a lot of influence on why we eventually moved towards an apology.
Which brings me to my next section, to today, and to the 3 apologies. So there were 3 apologies. The first was the Fairfax apology, the second was the parliamentary apology, and the third was the police apology. Is that correct?
That's correct. Well, I was particularly upset because Peter had been wronged by the judicial system and the police. I spoke to Peter about it and asked, because a number of 78ers has been saying there should be an apology, and I grew to be very, very close with Lance Garland over the years, and Lance had always said to me that they've never ever apologised for what they did to us on that day. Regardless of any arguments about permits and what happened, it was a non-violent celebration of who we are. So there really wasn't a justification for the police violence that occurred that night. So I felt that there was a justification to move towards an apology. So I started asking a lot of 78ers what their views were about an apology, and I particularly sought out the view of Peter Murphy, because it was a very emotional issue for Peter. But if there was to be an apology, I wanted to be sure in my own mind that it was something that Peter felt comfortable with. I'm getting an indication that people did support an apology, and that Peter would support an apology if it was done in the right way. I started asking a few questions amongst the MPs about the possibility of an apology. At that stage I was coordinating the 78ers, so I remember attending a celebration for the was it the 30th commemoration of the 1984 law reform, and a lot of the MPs from across the various parties were there. So I first spoke to Alex Greenwich, and Alex said to me that he thought it was a good idea to move forward towards an apology, but it may be a very difficult issue because people may raise compensation and may not want to make it any admissions of problems back then. But Alex said he would certainly support moving that way. He suggested I talk to other people from various parties. I went around the room and basically went to all the different factions and parties, and I spoke to the Greens, David Shoebridge. He was very supportive and said yes, it's time for an apology. He would definitely support that. I spoke to Penny Sharp from Labor Party. He was a bit reserved about it, and she was worried about what that may open up in terms of compo and issues about acknowledging what happened. But she still supported that something should happen. I spoke to Liberal Party, probably Bruce Notley-Smith.
Of the Liberal Party?
From the Liberal, and then he said that would be a bit of a hot potato as well, but he would definitely be keen to discuss that with his colleagues and look at that. And I spoke with Trevor Cann, who's from the Nationals, and he also said it would be a very difficult issue, but he would certainly be willing to look at it. Some time passed, and then there was the state elections. I attended a meet the Rainbow candidates. It was held behind Ultimo TAFE one evening, and there was a range of candidates there, including Penny Sharp from the ALP, Alex Greenwich as an independent, Jetty Leong as the Greens, Trevor Cann as Nationals, Bruce Notley-Smith with the Liberals. I put a public question to the 5 of them on the stage and said, after the elections, whether elected or not, would you support that there be an apology to the 78ers? All the candidates expressed that they would support working on an apology for the 78ers. So after the elections, and some people, well, all those people actually were elected to positions, I went back to them again and said, well, you made a promise, and the media also did a story on it, the Star Observer in Essex, and it started to gain momentum from there, and we started having meetings with the Rainbow MPs, who had then formed an alliance of Rainbow MPs.
So how did the apology actually happen?
Well, as I said, we had a series of meetings, and there was other 78ers involved, Barbara Kapitsky, Louise Calderon, Jane Mullins. We also had a larger group meeting at Alex's office at one point. I remember there's also Shane Brown there, Gary Wotherspoon, I think Ken Davis may have been there. It's a bit vague on the memory, but there is a photo with all of us in the room from that first formal meeting with the 78ers, where we discussed what such an apology could be and what it may say, and we started working on the draft. And then a few of us, like Barbara, Louise and Jane and myself, worked with Bruce Notley-Smith's office and Mitchell Price to draft the motion of apology. That went through a series of meetings, then we had a larger meeting with the 78ers before the final draft was approved.
So you'd worked on that draft?
Yes.
And then it came to Parliament?
Then it came to Parliament.
And you were there?
Yes, it's a very exciting day.
And it was delivered by Liberal Bruce Notley-Smith?
Yes.
And how did you feel about that when you saw it being delivered?
It was very moving, very emotional day, sitting in the House, watching it all unfold. I was very impressed by a number of speakers in the House from all sides of politics. Bruce led the motion discussion. I remember Alex speaking very passionately about it. I remember John Robinson from the Labor Party speaking very passionately about it. Trevor and Penny were in that house, but they because they're in the upper house, they weren't able to speak in the lower house, but they were certainly supportive. Jamie Parker from the Greens got up and spoke. There was a whole lot of support from across all the major parties and very moving speeches. I remember Gladys Pajotkin,
the current
Premier, gave a very moving, passionate speech about it. And I think all of them were talking from their heart.
I mean, some people have commented that the apology should have come directly from the then Premier, Mike Baird. How do you respond to that?
I think it would have been good to come from the Premier, but with the way the politics lied in trying to get that motion to be supported, which in the end was unanimously supported by the House, the Premier felt strategically the best way to do it was to have Bruce present the motion. And given that Bruce's history with our community, there was a good point to come from Bruce. So I understood that and I accepted that. A few of us did have a meeting with the Premier after that, on that day. It was a very positive meeting, and he certainly expressed his support for the motion and his gratitude for what we had done as a catalyst for leading towards that law reform.
Some people have also expressed concerns that the Liberal benches were pretty empty that day. Did that concern you at all?
It would have been nice to have it full at House, but there were quite a few MPs in the House, and I'm also very familiar from having been a lobbyist and worked in both state and federal parliaments that quite a few MPs don't always attend all these particular motion debates or question time, so that's not uncommon.
And for you the apology was sincere?
I think it was very sincere. I remember actually talking to Gladys in the luncheon room afterwards. I passed her and she gave me a friendly nod and we had a quick chat about it, and I really felt people were speaking from their heart. It wasn't about politics that day. It wasn't people getting up and grandstanding. People were actually saying what they felt. We also approached Sydney City Council and asked if they would also support that we have this motion of apology. And Clovermore and Christine Forster both strongly supported that the state government move towards an apology. And I remember after one of our meetings on discussing the apology that Christine gave me a call one night and said she'd spent some time talking to the then editor-in-chief of the Sydney Morning Herald, Darren Goodsir, and she'd had a vigorous debate with him about the importance of having an apology from the Sydney Morning Herald. On the morning of the parliamentary apology, I had a phone call from Darren Goodsir, who was then the editor-in-chief of Sydney Morning Herald, and he congratulated us on the upcoming parliamentary apology, and he offered his apology to the 78ers on behalf of Fairfax. He had let me know that they were going to publish that apology online with the Sydney Morning Herald, and he also later texted me to confirm that it would also be in The Age in Melbourne.
Why was an apology needed from the Sydney Morning Herald?
The damage that was done by the Sydney Morning Herald, but mind you, it was also done by the Telegraph, but not to the same extent because they didn't give as many details about those who arrested. Although it was to some extent a normal practice of the media to release the names and age and street address and occupation of people arrested, in a time that there was such discrimination and very bad community attitudes towards our gay, lesbian, transgender communities, that was extremely damaging. I know that a lot of 78ers lost their jobs over that, over being named. Some copped a lot of harassment at work. Some lost support of family and peer. So it was very damaging to a lot of people.
Did you find that first Fairfax Sydney Morning Herald apology sincere?
The apology was issued from Darren Goodsir on behalf of the Sydney Morning Herald. I think was very, very much sincere.
Because there were two apologies, wasn't there? There was the first one from Fairfax and there was a second one later on, I think a few months later. Why were two needed?
It wasn't really a second one, but what happened was the Fairfax offered to have a night to give the apology in person. They felt it was important to apologise in person and not just through the media. Fairfax also didn't make a big media issue of their apology because they didn't want it to be politicised. They wanted it to be a heartfelt apology. And we had met with Fairfax. Peter Murphy was involved in those discussions with Fairfax, with myself. Following the parliamentary apology and after the apology from the New South Wales Police by Superintendent Tony Crandall, Fairfax invited us, the 78ers, to Fairfax headquarters in Sydney to apologise in person. Darren Goodsir delivered a very heartfelt speech of apology on behalf of Fairfax, and a number of the staff also spoke to the 78ers on that evening, and we were very moved and taken by the apology given by Fairfax to the 78ers. We particularly tried to concentrate on those who had been arrested that fateful night on the 24th of June 78.
Now the final apology, and some would say the bigger one, or the biggest one, even bigger perhaps than the parliamentary apology in some ways, was the New South Wales Police apology, which a lot of people had been seeking for a long time. How did you feel about that? You were present, weren't you?
Yes, a few 78ers were present on the morning. It was at the normal media launch of the Mardi Gras parade. And that morning, I'd been advised in advance that the police were going to make a statement in support of an apology. So that was the first indication there was any suggestion that the police would apologise. I had let my fellow 78ers know that morning that there was likely to be some sort of announcement. We didn't know that until we arrived. Inspector Tony Crandall gave an apology on behalf of the New South Wales Police.
Was he superintendent or inspector? Well, he was a high-ranking officer.
Yes, I'm sorry, I may have got the titles wrong there, but...
so he gave the apology?
He gave an apology.
And that was at the press conference ahead of the Mardi Gras parade?
Yeah, it was all in the one event. It was a very moving speech that he gave. And again, when I talk about Tony and even Darren giving speeches, they weren't really speeches, they were heartfelt words of apology to us.
So definitely sincere.
It was very sincere. A few of us spoke to Tony afterwards, and I spent some time talking to Tony afterwards, and I think it was extremely sincere apology.
A few critics have said that it should have come from the Commissioner. How do you respond to that?
I think it would be really great if a Commissioner would actually release an apology. Again, it was tied up in the politics of the day, that the Commissioner himself was probably not that comfortable to issue that apology, but it was fully supported by the Commissioner.
And you accept that apology?
I accept the spirit of what the apology was given, and yes, I would actually regard that was a police apology, because the wording of that apology was on behalf of the New South Wales Police.
How do you feel then now about the police marching in Mardi Gras?
I think it's great. It's a little bit surreal that you're actually marching with police and even defence forces, people that once upon a time there used to be a lot of discrimination for our community so it's very different seeing all that.
Every year you're on the 78 bus, and you're not the first in the parade, but you are one of the first. How do you feel when you're on that bus, you're waving to the crowds and they're all cheering you on? Do you feel like a hero?
I don't like to say I feel like a hero. I just feel we did what was right at the time. I think that what we did back then is not a lot different to what people are doing now when they go to a marriage equality rally. We were standing up for what we believed in. That night, the evening procession was not a protest as such, but a celebration of who we are. But the very fact that we're marching, celebrating who we are in a time of such huge discrimination, is a protest in itself. So I think, and we weren't the start of it, we were just a culmination of events that have been happening for a number of years working towards these rights.
A couple more questions.
Yes.
What advice would you give to the organisers of the current Mardi Gras to improve it? No, I've been very involved with Mardi Gras for the last few years. I didn't always march with the 78ers. It wasn't until about the 20th anniversary, I think, was the first time that the 78ers had really actually got together as a group for the Mardi Gras. Lance and I often were involved in organising other floats with other different groups, from political groups to social groups. So what advice would you give to improve it?
These days, I think it really needs to come back to a stronger community link, and that people shouldn't be afraid of that community link. I think some are very unsure how such a community engagement may impact on Mardi Gras. We understand it's very different times. It's very hard to run a major event like that without commercial support. It's an extremely expensive adventure for Mardi Gras to run Mardi Gras season. And I, over the years, have an events background, and I can see the challenges that an event like Mardi Gras has in terms of recouping the costs of running a parade. You need to get that balance right. I think commercial sponsors should come on board, but those sponsors need to show a genuine commitment to dealing with acceptance and discrimination in their workplaces or their places of business. They need to not just be coming on board because they want to promote their product, but because they actually genuinely are a part of and believe in our community.
You've just touched upon it. What are some of the biggest changes you've seen with the Mardi Gras parade?
Well, obviously it's grown into something that's quite large and spectacular. It's a series of events that go on for some 3 weeks. now, whereas we were just one night with one day with 3 events. But I still say that Mardi Gras, which is still really a celebration of who we are, is a beacon for our community. I often go out into rural communities and into the western suburbs, into areas where discrimination has been hard for people. And locals come up to me and say, what's happening at Mardi Gras next year? It obviously has a huge impact in our communities, right across the state, right across Australia, and even overseas, that we influence how other countries look at our rights and how those rights should be improved in other countries. So I think Mardi Gras definitely has a place, and it still has that place through the parade.
What advice do you have for the activists of today?
I think you still need to keep up the fight. Sadly, we were fighting conservatism back in the 70s. It seems that we're back in that swing again in these political times. When you look at the conservative changes in the States at the moment, even swings in Europe, things happening in places like Russia and Chechnya, Iran, many countries where discrimination is still quite strong. These issues are still out there, still need to be fought, and we need to be very mindful of the fact that things can easily swing back the other way if we don't keep an eye on our communities.
What advice do you have for the young Steve Warren of 40 years ago?
Gosh, that's a good question.
Do you have any?
I don't think I would have changed anything. I mean, there were good times and bad times, but the first Mardi Gras was good times and bad times. We celebrated who we are, but it had that awful experience at the end of it. But we came through that. I think it's about sticking by your principles, being strong, standing up for your rights. And that's what I think is important today as well.
And finally, any hopes for the future?
Well, it would be very interesting for our 40th anniversary. I hope it's something that brings us together and is a real celebration for all of us about where we've come to today and how we've got there. People need to be reminded of how we got there. It's just not just a parade of fun. It's about standing up for ourselves.